The alarm on my console screamed before I even understood why, and my hands were already moving across the controls before my mind caught up with them. Red light bathed the command deck of my scout ship, the Windrunner, and every instrument in front of me was telling me the same impossible thing. A signal had come alive in a region of space that had been silent for 10,000 years. My name is Voren Kaas, and I have spent my whole career studying borders that were never supposed to move. I am Thessari, born on a world 3 systems away from the line that every civilized species in this galaxy has been taught to fear since before written history. We call that line the Hollow Border. Beyond it lies a region my people named the Forbidden Reach, though the humans who once lived there simply called it home. I did not choose to be the one sitting in this chair when the silence broke. I was assigned to routine patrol duty along the outer edge of the quarantine zone, the kind of posting given to officers who are competent but unremarkable, the kind of job where nothing ever happens. That was the entire point of my existence in the fleet. Nothing was supposed to happen. For 10,000 years nothing had. Every child across 100 worlds grows up hearing the same warning, whispered by parents, taught in schools, carved into the walls of ancient temples that predate the founding of the Galactic Council itself. Never awaken the humans. Never cross the hollow border. Never send a signal, a probe, a ship, or even a stray radio wave into that dead and silent region of space. The warning is so old that most people have forgotten what it actually means. It has become a fairy tale, a bedtime story parents use to keep their children from wandering too far from home. Somewhere out there, past the edge of everything we know, sleeps something that must never be woken. I used to tell that story to my younger siblings when I was barely old enough to understand it myself. I remember sitting by the fire vents of our home cave, my little sister Ilsa curled against my side, asking me why the humans were locked away. I told her what everyone tells their children. I said the humans did something terrible once, so terrible that the ancient council sealed their entire species behind an invisible wall and posted watchers along it forever, just in case they ever woke up and remembered how to reach the stars again. The truth is that nobody alive actually knows what happened. The records from that era were either destroyed or hidden so completely that even the Council's oldest archives contain only fragments. A date. A single sentence describing something called the First Silence. A star chart with an entire cluster of systems marked with a symbol that translates roughly to "Do not return." That is all we have. That is all anyone has had for 10,000 years, and yet the fear has never faded. If anything, it has grown stronger with every generation that repeats the warning without understanding it. Fear that has no explanation is the most powerful kind, because there is nothing to reason with, nothing to measure, nothing to test. You cannot argue with a silence that has lasted 10,000 years. You can only respect it. The Council built an entire fleet whose sole purpose is to guard the hollow border, not to attack anything on the other side, but simply to make sure nothing on our side ever gets close enough to find out what is there. Thousands of officers like me have spent entire careers on this watch, staring at empty space, tracking asteroid drift and cosmic dust, filing reports that say the same thing every single day. No activity detected. No activity detected. No activity detected, until 3 hours ago, when my console lit up with a signal pattern that did not match anything in 10,000 years of recorded silence. I remember the exact moment I saw it. I was drinking a cup of warmed mineral broth, watching the sensor feed out of habit rather than expectation, when a small burst of energy flickered across my display from deep inside the Forbidden Reach. At first I assumed it was a sensor glitch, the kind of false alarm that happens once or twice a year when solar radiation interferes with our long-range instruments. I ran a diagnostic. The signal held steady. I ran a second diagnostic, this time cross-referencing it against 3 separate arrays positioned along different points of the border. All 3 confirmed the same reading. Something inside the quarantine zone had just turned on. I sat there for a long moment, my broth forgotten, my hands hovering over the comms panel. Protocol required me to report any anomaly immediately to Border Command, no matter how small. I had filed 1,000 routine reports in my career, each one a formality, each one met with a board acknowledgement, from whichever officer was on duty at the receiving end. This felt different. My hands were not steady when I opened the channel. Border Command. This is Scout Vessel Windrunner. Designation Vorenkas reporting. I am detecting an active energy signature originating from within the hollow border, approximately 4 light-years past the boundary line. Coordinates transmitting now. There was a pause on the other end, longer than any pause I had ever experienced during a routine report. When the voice finally came back, it belonged to Commander Ashra Delvey, a stern older officer who had overseen border operations for longer than I had been alive. Repeat that, Windrunner. I repeated it. I heard her exhale slowly through the comm, the kind of exhale a person makes when they are trying very hard not to sound alarmed. Hold your position, she said. Do not approach the signal. Do not transmit anything further into the zone. I am escalating this to Fleet Command immediately. I held my position. I sat in the dark of my cockpit, watching that single point of light pulse on my display, and I felt something I had never felt before during my years of service. Not curiosity, not excitement. A cold, crawling dread that started in my stomach and worked its way up through my chest until it settled behind my eyes, like a weight I could not blink away. 10,000 years. 10,000 years of silence, and now this. Within the hour, my quiet corner of border space had transformed into something unrecognizable. Ships began arriving from 3 different sectors, drawn by the same alert that had pulled me out of my routine. Fleet Command dispatched a survey cruiser, called the Aldebra, crewed by specialists, trained specifically for first contact scenarios, though none of them had ever imagined they would use that training here, on this border, against this silence. I recognized the ship's markings before I recognized the voice that hailed me. Windrunner, this is Captain Idris Calloway, aboard the Aldebra. We are inbound to your position. Fleet Command wants confirmation on the signal before anyone makes a move deeper into the zone. Calloway was not Thesari. He belonged to a species called the Voth, tall and pale-skinned with elongated limbs built for low-gravity environments, and he had a reputation across the fleet for being unshakable under pressure. I had heard stories about him from other officers, stories about how he had once talked a hostile alien faction into standing down without firing a single shot. If anyone could handle whatever was happening at the border, it would be him, but even Calloway's voice carried a strain I had never heard from him before. He was trying to sound calm. He was failing. Confirmed signal, still active, I told him. No further changes in the last 40 minutes. The pattern appears to be some kind of automated broadcast rather than a directed transmission. It is not responding to anything, and it does not appear to be searching for anything. It is simply on. Understood. Hold position and maintain observation. We will rendezvous with you within the hour. I sat alone with that signal for the entire hour, watching it pulse steadily on my display, feeling smaller with every passing minute. I thought about my sister Ilsa, now grown with children of her own, still telling the same bedtime story I once told her, still warning her own children never to wander too close to the hollow border. I thought about every council session I had ever read transcripts of, every debate about whether the quarantine should ever be lifted, every single time those debates had ended with the same conclusion. Leave it alone. Whatever is out there, leave it alone. I understood, in that hour of waiting, that the decision had already been made for us. Something out there had decided it no longer wished to be left alone. When the Aldebra finally arrived alongside my small scout vessel, its much larger hull blotting out a section of the stars behind it, I felt a strange relief at no longer being alone with what I had found. Captain Calloway's face appeared on my view screen, framed by the dim lighting of his command deck. Behind him, I could see other officers moving with quiet urgency, checking instruments, exchanging hushed words. Talk me through everything you observed. From the beginning, Calloway said. Leave nothing out, no matter how small it seems. I told him everything. The exact time the signal first appeared. The pattern of its pulses, steady and unbroken, unlike anything generated by natural phenomena. The way 3 separate sensor arrays had confirmed its origin point deep inside territory that had shown absolutely no activity for 10 millennia. I told him about the strange calm certainty I felt, a certainty I could not explain, that whatever had activated that signal was not an accident. Calloway listened without interrupting, his expression unreadable, until I finished. Then he was quiet for a long moment, staring at something just off camera, perhaps a display showing the same data I had already sent him. "There is a survey team missing," he said finally. A civilian mining vessel called the Halvorsen Star filed a flight plan 3 days ago that would have taken it along the outer edge of the quarantine boundary, well outside restricted space, according to their paperwork. They stopped responding to check-in calls 26 hours ago. Fleet Command assumed equipment failure. Given what we are seeing now, that assumption no longer seems safe. A cold feeling spread through my chest. "You think they crossed the border?" "I think," Calloway said carefully, "that somebody, somewhere, decided the old rule did not apply to them. And I think we are about to find out exactly why that rule existed in the first place." He ordered his crew to begin plotting a course along the last known heading of the missing mining vessel, a heading that curved directly toward the source of the signal I had detected. I watched his hands move across his own console, steady despite everything, and I found myself both grateful and terrified that I would be accompanying his ship deeper into space. No living being from either of our worlds had entered in 10,000 years. "Windrunner, you are ordered to escort the Aldebra to the edge of the boundary line," Calloway said. "You will not cross with us. Your scout vessel does not have the shielding or the crew complement for what we might encounter. You will maintain observation distance and relay everything back to Border Command in real time." "Understood, Captain." I hesitated, then added something that was not strictly part of protocol. "Be careful out there." Calloway's expression softened, just slightly, the first crack in his composed exterior since our conversation began. "We have spent 10,000 years being careful, Vorenkas. Perhaps it is time we found out whether that carefulness was ever the right choice." The two ships moved together through the dark, the Aldebra's mass overshadowing my smaller vessel, as we approached a boundary line that existed only as coordinates in a database, invisible to the naked eye, yet more real and more feared than any physical wall could ever be. I watched the signal grow stronger on my display as we closed the distance, that same steady pulse, patient and unbothered by our approach, as though whatever had sent it already knew we were coming and felt no need to hurry. I thought about all the stories I had grown up with, all the warnings, all the fear passed down through generation after generation without explanation. I thought about how easy it had been to respect a rule I did not understand, simply because everyone around me respected it too. And I thought, as the boundary line grew closer and closer on my navigation display, about how quickly 10,000 years of careful silence could unravel once someone, somewhere, decided to test it. The Aldebra reached the boundary first. I watched its running lights slow to a crawl as Calloway ordered a full stop exactly at the line marking the edge of the hollow border, the invisible wall between everything we knew and everything we had spent 10 millennia refusing to look at directly. For a long moment, nothing happened. The signal pulsed on. The stars did not care. My own ship drifted at a respectful distance, sensors recording every fraction of a second, transmitting it all back to Border Command as ordered. Then Calloway's voice came through my comm one final time, before the Aldebra crossed the line that no ship from our side had crossed in 10,000 years. "Windrunner, for the record, we are crossing the boundary at 0400 hours, standard time. If anyone asks what we found out here, tell them the truth. Tell them we went looking for answers, and we found something we never expected." I watched his ship slide forward, past the invisible line, into territory that existed in our history only as a warning whispered to frightened children. I watched it grow smaller against the darkness of the forbidden reach, until it was nothing more than a distant point of light, and then nothing at all. I sat alone at the boundary, staring into a silence that had just begun to break, and I understood with absolute certainty that whatever happened next would change everything I had ever believed about the galaxy I lived in. The waiting had ended. The awakening had begun. 4 hours passed before Border Command allowed me to move from my observation point, and every minute of that waiting felt heavier than the last. I kept my sensors locked on the last known heading of the Aldebra, watching for any flicker of returning transmission, any sign that Captain Calloway and his crew had survived whatever waited for them on the other side of the hollow border. The silence that answered me was worse than any alarm could have been. When the order finally came through, it was not from Commander Delvey, but from a voice I did not recognize, sharp and clipped with authority I had never heard directed at me before. Windrunner, this is Fleet Command Director Sorne Iskal. You are ordered to proceed across the boundary line and rendezvous with the Aldebra at the following coordinates. Maintain full sensor recording at all times. You are the second vessel from our side of the border to ever cross it in recorded history. Act accordingly. I did not answer right away. My hand hovered over the controls that would carry my small ship past the line I had spent my entire career defending from the outside. Every instinct built into me by a lifetime of warnings screamed that this was wrong, that nothing good waited beyond that boundary, that the silence had been kept for a reason nobody living could remember, but everybody living still respected. Acknowledge, Director, I said, and I pushed my ship forward before I could talk myself out of it. The moment I crossed the invisible line, nothing changed. That was somehow the most unsettling part of it all. I had half expected some physical sensation, some shift in the fabric of space itself, something to mark the crossing of a boundary so deeply woven into the fear of an entire galaxy. Instead, there was only the same starfield, the same dark silence, the same hum of my ship's engines carrying me forward into territory that had swallowed a captain, a crew, and a mining vessel without a single word of explanation. I followed the coordinates Director Sorn had given me, my sensors sweeping the darkness ahead for any sign of the Aldebra. The forbidden reach looked, at first glance, exactly like any other stretch of empty space. Stars burned in the distance, indifferent to the history hanging over this region. Dust drifted in slow currents, disturbed by nothing. It was almost peaceful, in a way that made the fear coiled in my chest feel foolish and small. Then my sensors picked up debris. It began as scattered fragments, small pieces of metal tumbling silently through the void, catching starlight in brief flashes before disappearing back into darkness. I slowed my approach, my pulse quickening as the debris field grew denser the further I traveled. Larger sections of hull plating drifted past my viewport, their edges twisted and torn in ways that told a story I did not want to read. I recognized the markings on one particularly large fragment before I wanted to. It belonged to the Halvorsen Star, the missing civilian mining vessel Calloway had mentioned before crossing the border. I slowed my ship to a crawl, weaving carefully between larger pieces of wreckage, my sensors cataloging every fragment as protocol demanded, even as a part of me wanted to look away from what I was finding. There was no sign of survivors among the debris, no escape pods, no life signs registering anywhere within sensor range. Whatever had happened to this ship had happened quickly and completely. Windrunner to Aldebra, do you copy? Static answered me at first, then a voice broke through, weaker than before but unmistakably Calloway's. Windrunner, we read you. Proceed to our position with caution. We have located the source of the debris field, and we have located something else. I followed his coordinates through the scattered wreckage until the Aldebra came into view, its running lights casting long shadows across the debris drifting around it. Calloway's ship had come to a full stop beside something that made my sensors flicker with confusion before settling into readings I did not fully understand. A structure hung motionless in space, ahead of the Aldebra, far smaller than either of our vessels, roughly the size of a large shuttlecraft, its surface a dull gray material, unlike anything in our catalog database. It bore no visible weapons, no propulsion systems that I could identify, no markings of any kind except for a single pulsing light near its center, the same signal I had detected hours earlier from my post along the border. I asked, though some part of me already suspected the answer. We believe it is a monitoring buoy, Calloway said, ancient, by the readings we are getting, but recently reactivated. It appears to have been dormant for exactly as long as the quarantine has existed. Something woke it up. Woke it up how? There was a pause before Calloway answered, and when he did, his voice carried a weight I had not heard from him before. The Halvorsen Star did not simply stray too close to the border, Vorenkas. Their flight logs, which we recovered from a partially intact data core among the wreckage, show they were searching for something specific, rare mineral deposits, the kind that command enormous prices on black markets across a dozen systems. Their captain, a man named Declan Ashworth, deliberately falsified his flight plan to hide his true destination from fleet oversight. He knew he was entering restricted space. He did it anyway. I felt something cold settle in my stomach. He woke this thing up on purpose? Not on purpose, but close enough that it hardly matters now. Our best analysis suggests his mining equipment triggered some kind of proximity sensor built into this buoy, a sensor that had been waiting, patiently, for exactly this kind of intrusion for 10,000 years. The moment his equipment breached a certain threshold, the buoy activated, and then, according to what little data we recovered, something responded to that activation almost instantly. Responded how? Calloway's silence stretched long enough that I began to wonder if the comm connection had failed. When he finally spoke again, his voice was quieter than I had ever heard it. The Halverson Star's final logs describe a single vessel appearing without warning, without any detectable approach, as though it had simply been waiting nearby the entire time. The logs describe no aggression from this vessel, no weapons fire, no boarding action, simply a voice, transmitted directly into their communication systems, calm and measured, asking them to leave immediately and never return. And they didn't leave. Captain Ashworth's final log entry states his intention to attempt one more mining run before departing, believing the warning to be an automated defense system rather than an actual sentient response. His exact words were recorded as, quote, "They will not stop us for one more haul," unquote. I stared at the debris field surrounding us, at the twisted remains of a ship whose captain had gambled everything on the assumption that 10,000 years of silence meant 10,000 years of emptiness, that the old warnings were nothing more than superstition standing between him and a fortune. I understood, looking at the wreckage of his choice, exactly how wrong that assumption had been. What happened after that final entry? I asked, though I was not certain I wanted the answer. The data core ends there. Whatever happened next was either not recorded, or the recording device did not survive the encounter. We drifted in silence for a long moment, both of us staring at the ancient buoy hanging between our two ships, its single light pulsing steadily, patient and unbothered, exactly as it had been when I first detected it from across the boundary. It occurred to me that this small, unremarkable-looking device had done more to shape the fear of an entire galaxy than any weapon or fleet ever could. It had simply been waiting here, silent and forgotten, ready to wake something that everyone had assumed was long dead. "Director Sorn is going to want a full report," I said finally. "What are you going to tell Fleet Command?" "The truth," Calloway said, "that the quarantine held for 10,000 years because nobody was foolish enough or desperate enough to test it. That a single greedy man broke that streak in a matter of hours, and that whatever answered his intrusion did not sound like a monster from a children's story. It sounded calm, measured, almost patient. That worries me more than any threat ever could." I found myself agreeing with him, though I could not entirely articulate why. A threat that screamed and raged could be understood, predicted, prepared for. A threat that responded to trespass, with quiet, unhurried warning, carried a different kind of danger entirely. The danger of something that had faced this exact situation before and knew precisely how it would unfold. "Should we attempt to make contact with this buoy directly?" I asked. "Try to learn more about what it recorded, what triggered its activation exactly." "Fleet Command has already ordered a full technical team to rendezvous with our position within the next 12 hours, Calloway said. "Our orders are to hold position and secure the area, nothing more. We are not to attempt direct interface with the buoy or any device we cannot fully identify. Given what happened to the Halvorsen star, I am inclined to follow that order to the letter." We held our position through the following hours, cataloging debris, recording every fragment of data our sensors could gather, waiting for the technical team Fleet Command had promised. I spent much of that time simply staring at the ancient buoy drifting silently between our ships, wondering what kind of mind had built something capable of summoning a response from an entire species across 10,000 years of silence, with nothing more than a single triggered sensor. It was during the 8th hour of waiting that my sensors picked up something new, something that made every hair on my body stand on end, despite the fact that Thessari physiology does not typically produce that particular reaction. A second signal had appeared, distinct from the buoy, moving toward our position at a speed my scout ship's sensors struggled to properly calculate. "Aldebra, are you reading this?" I asked, my voice tighter than I intended. "We see it," Calloway replied, and for the first time since I had met him, I heard something close to genuine alarm in his voice. "Whatever triggered that buoy is not simply a recording device, Voronkas. Something is answering it directly, and it is coming this way." I watched the signal grow closer on my display, my hands trembling slightly against the controls, despite every year of training that had taught me to remain calm under pressure. 10,000 years of silence had just ended, and whatever was approaching us now represented the first direct contact any living being from our side of the galaxy had experienced with the species we had spent our entire history fearing without understanding. "Should we retreat?" I asked, though some part of me already suspected what answer Calloway would give. "Fleet Command's orders are clear," he said. "We hold our position and observe. If this is truly first contact, running from it now would tell them everything they need to know about how afraid we still are, and I suspect that fear is exactly what led to whatever happened 10,000 years ago in the first place. We hold, we watch, we learn." I forced myself to keep my hands steady on the controls, my sensors locked on the approaching signal, my mind racing through every scrap of legend and warning I had ever heard about the species sleeping beyond the hollow border. None of those stories had prepared me for the calm, deliberate way that signal continued its approach, unhurried, confident, entirely unafraid of two alien vessels sitting in the middle of what should have been dead, empty space. Whatever was coming toward us had waited 10,000 years for this exact moment, and now, at last, it had arrived. The signal resolved into a visible shape faster than my sensors predicted, which told me something important before I had even seen the vessel itself. Whatever technology powered that ship moved in ways our own instruments struggled to properly calculate, arriving sooner than the numbers on my display had suggested it should. It was smaller than I expected. After 10,000 years of stories describing monstrous fleets and world-ending weapons, the ship that emerged from the darkness ahead of us looked almost modest by comparison to the Aldebra's bulk. Sleek, dark-hulled, with lines that seemed almost deliberately simple, it carried none of the aggressive angles or visible weapon arrays that our own warships displayed with obvious pride. It looked, if anything, like a vessel built by people who did not feel the need to advertise their strength. That should have comforted me. It did not. "Unidentified vessel, this is Captain Idris Calloway of the exploration cruiser Aldebra, representing the Galactic Council. Please respond." The silence that followed stretched long enough that I began to wonder if the ship intended to respond at all. Then a voice came through our combined comm channels, calm, clear, and carrying an accent unlike anything in our linguistic archives, though the words themselves were somehow already rendered into a language both of us could understand perfectly. "Aldebra, this is Captain Ethan Cole of the vessel Farsight. I read you clearly. I would ask that both your ships power down any active weapon systems and hold your current position. We are not here to cause harm, but I would prefer this conversation begin without either of us feeling the need to defend ourselves." Calloway's voice, when he responded, carried the careful diplomacy of a man who had spent his entire career learning how to speak to strangers without giving offense. "Captain Cole, our weapons are already powered down, and have been since we entered this region. We came here searching for a missing civilian vessel, and found only wreckage. We would like to understand what happened here, if you are willing to share that information." "I am willing," Cole said, and something in his tone shifted slightly, softening in a way that caught me off guard. "Though I suspect you already know the shape of it, even without the details. Your missing ship ignored a clear warning. That warning was given with more patience than perhaps it deserved, and the outcome was still not what any of us wanted." "No," Cole said, and I felt a wave of relief pass through me at the answer. "The crew of your mining vessel is alive and, as far as we can determine, unharmed. They are currently aboard my ship, held in quarters that are comfortable, if not particularly luxurious. I intend to return them to your custody once we have finished this conversation." I found myself staring at my display, trying to reconcile the calm, almost gentle voice coming through our comm system with the 10,000 years of warnings that had shaped every aspect of my upbringing. This did not sound like something that needed to be feared. And yet something in the careful, measured way Cole spoke, something in the complete absence of urgency or aggression in his voice, unsettled me more than open hostility ever could have. "Captain Cole," I said, finding my own voice for the first time since the human vessel had arrived. "My name is Voren Kaas. I am the officer who first detected the buoy activation that led us here. May I ask a question?" "Of course," Cole said, and I noted the immediate shift in his attention toward me, as though my simple request for permission had earned some measure of consideration I had not expected. "Why did your people never leave that quarantine zone in 10,000 years? Was it truly a punishment imposed by the ancient council, or was it something else?" The pause before Cole answered felt longer than any silence in our conversation so far. When he finally spoke, his voice carried a weight that made me understand, for the first time, that whatever history existed between our galaxy and his species was far more complicated than any bedtime story had ever suggested. That is a fair question, and one I am not authorized to answer fully at this time. What I can tell you is that the choice to remain isolated was not entirely imposed upon us from the outside. There was agreement on both sides that separation served everyone's interests, at least for a while. 10,000 years is a very long time to hold to any agreement, however. Things change. People forget why rules exist. Eventually, someone always tests the boundary, whether out of curiosity, greed, or simple forgetfulness. And when that boundary gets tested, Calloway asked tearfully, "What happens next?" "That depends entirely on what happens after the testing," Cole said. "In this case, a single ship strayed into restricted space seeking profit. We gave clear warning. They ignored it. We removed them from the situation without harm, and now we are having what I would consider a fairly civil conversation with two representatives of the Galactic Council. I would call that a reasonably good outcome, all things considered." I noticed something in the way he phrased that last sentence, a careful precision that suggested he had chosen his words with deliberate caution, as though there existed other outcomes far less civil that he had no intention of describing to us directly. I filed that observation away, uncertain what to make of it, uncertain whether I even wanted to understand it fully. "Captain Cole," I said, "would you be willing to allow direct contact between our vessels, a meeting, in person, so that we might better understand each other?" Calloway glanced toward his own comm panel, and I could sense his hesitation even through the visual feed, the careful weighing of protocol against opportunity that defined so much of diplomatic service. Before he could respond, Cole answered for both of them. "I would be willing to consider that, though I would want to confirm with my own command structure before making any final arrangements. This encounter, however civil it has remained so far, represents a significant deviation from established protocol on my end as well. I am not authorized to simply invite alien vessels aboard my ship without proper clearance, any more than you would be authorized to invite an unknown species onto one of your own council vessels without similar approval." "That seems reasonable," Calloway said, and I could hear the careful diplomat in him working to keep his voice steady, despite what must have been an overwhelming flood of implications behind Cole's simple statement: command structure, protocol, clearance procedures. These were not the trappings of some savage, forgotten species locked away for being uncontrollable. These were the careful, deliberate systems of an organized, disciplined civilization that had simply chosen, for reasons still unclear to us, to remain silent and separate from the rest of the galaxy for 10,000 years. "While we wait for that clearance," Cole continued, "I would be willing to transfer your missing crew back to your custody immediately, along with a full account of the circumstances leading to their detention. I imagine that would ease some of the concern your council will undoubtedly express once word of this encounter reaches them." "That would be greatly appreciated," Calloway said. I watched on my sensor display as a smaller craft detached from the far site, moving with the same eerie precision as its parent vessel. carrying what I assumed to be the crew of the Halverson Star, toward the Aldebra's docking bay. The entire maneuver took less time than I expected, executed with a smoothness that spoke of extensive training and discipline, yet without any of the rigid, mechanical coldness I might have expected from a species that had inspired 10,000 years of fear. While the transfer occurred, I found myself studying the Farsight more closely through my own sensors, cataloging every detail I could gather about its construction, its systems, the faint energy signatures bleeding from various sections of its hull. Much of what I detected made no sense according to any physics my education had prepared me to understand. Power readings that fluctuated in patterns suggesting deliberate restraint rather than the natural limitations of the technology itself. Shield configurations that seemed almost lazily maintained, as though the ship's systems considered the current situation barely worth the effort of full activation. It was the crew, however, that unsettled me most, glimpsed briefly through a viewport as the transfer shuttle departed. I caught sight of perhaps half a dozen figures moving through what appeared to be a cargo bay, and something about the way they carried themselves struck me as deeply contradictory. They laughed among themselves, exchanged casual gestures I recognized as playful mockery between colleagues comfortable enough with each other to tease without malice. And yet beneath that casual ease I noticed something else, a certain quality of alertness in their posture, a readiness in the way they positioned themselves near exits and equipment stations that suggested predators who had simply chosen, for the moment, to relax their guard slightly rather than abandon it entirely. "Vorenkas," Calloway said quietly over a private channel between our two ships, his voice carrying none of the diplomatic calm he had projected during his conversation with Cole. "What do you make of what we are seeing here?" I considered my answer carefully before responding. "I think, Captain, that we have spent 10,000 years being afraid of the wrong thing. Meaning I do not believe these people are monsters waiting to be provoked into savagery. I believe they are something far more unsettling. I believe they are disciplined, patient, and entirely capable of extraordinary restraint, right up until the moment that restraint no longer serves their purposes. And I believe that if we ever find ourselves on the wrong side of that line, 10,000 years of quarantine will feel like a mercy compared to what comes next." Calloway did not respond immediately, and in his silence I recognized my own fear reflected back at me, the slow, creeping realization that the ancient warning passed down through every generation of our history had never been about avoiding something monstrous and uncontrolled. It had been about avoiding something patient, deliberate, and utterly certain of its own capabilities. The transfer shuttle docked with the Aldebra moments later, and Calloway excused himself briefly to oversee the return of the Halverson Star's crew, leaving me alone on my own vessel with the Farsight still holding steady in the darkness ahead of me. I studied the ship in silence, wondering what other secrets lay hidden behind its unassuming exterior, wondering what history our two civilizations shared that neither side seemed fully willing to discuss. "Vorenkas," Cole's voice came through my private comm channel, catching me off guard. "I wanted to speak with you directly, if you don't mind." "Of course, Captain. You asked me an interesting question earlier about why my people remained isolated for so long. I gave you an incomplete answer, and I want you to understand that the incompleteness was not meant as disrespect. There are decisions above my authority regarding what can and cannot be shared at this stage of contact. But I will tell you this much, because I think you deserve honesty, even where I cannot offer full disclosure. I'm listening. The old rule your people have followed for 10,000 years exists because the alternative was worse for everyone involved, including us. We did not choose isolation because we were ashamed or diminished by what happened before the quarantine began. We chose it because we understood, better than anyone, exactly what we were capable of if provoked again, and there are some capabilities that responsible people choose to lock away, not because they cannot be trusted with them, but because using them even once changes something inside a person that can never fully be undone. I sat with those words in silence for a long moment, feeling the weight of them settle over me like a shadow I could not quite shake. "And now that the quarantine has been broken?" "Now," Cole said, his voice carrying something that sounded almost like sadness, "we find out together whether 10,000 years of careful restraint was strong enough to survive contact with a galaxy that has already begun forgetting why the rule existed in the first place. The channel went quiet after that, and I sat alone in my cockpit, staring at the sleek, unassuming shape of the far sight, drifting silently in the darkness ahead of me, understanding for the first time that the true danger had never been the humans waking up. The true danger was what happened next, and none of us, on either side of that ancient border, could say with any certainty how it would end. News of what happened at the boundary reached every corner of Council space faster than any of us anticipated, and within 3 days, the quiet dread I had felt alone in my cockpit had become a galaxy-wide phenomenon impossible to ignore. Every news channel, every government broadcast, every private communication network carried some version of the same message. The humans were awake. The old quarantine had failed. Nobody knew what would happen next. I was recalled to Council headquarters on the capital world of Threnvasa almost immediately after filing my report alongside Calloway's, and I spent the transit journey watching the reaction unfold across a dozen different news feeds, each one more frantic than the last. Some channels treated the news with barely restrained panic, replaying grainy sensor footage of the far site alongside dramatic narration warning of imminent invasion. Others adopted a more measured tone, interviewing historians and archivists who admitted, almost sheepishly, that nobody currently alive actually understood why the quarantine had been established in the first place. That admission troubled me more than any panicked broadcast could have. An entire galaxy had organized its fear around a rule nobody could explain, and now that rule had broken, leaving nothing behind but uncertainty and old, half-remembered warnings that no longer felt like enough. When I arrived at Council headquarters, I was escorted directly to a private chamber, where Director Sorne Iskal waited alongside several other high-ranking officials I recognized from various council committees. The room felt smaller than I expected, given the magnitude of what we were there to discuss, and the tension hanging over every face in attendance made the air feel thick and difficult to breathe. "Vorenkas," Director Sorn said as I entered, her voice carrying the same commanding authority I remembered from our first exchange over comm channels, though up close I could see exhaustion etched into the lines of her face. "Thank you for coming so quickly. I imagine the last several days have been difficult for you." "They have, Director," I admitted, "though I suspect they have been difficult for everyone across Council space right now." "An understatement," said an older official seated near the far end of the table, whose nameplate identified him as Councillor Brant Aldis. "We have received demands from at least a dozen member worlds calling for immediate militarization of the border. Others are calling for a formal apology to the human species for 10,000 years of unjust isolation, and still others believe we should simply pretend this entire encounter never happened and hope the humans return to their silence on their own." "None of those responses seem particularly wise," I said before I could stop myself. Director Sorn's expression shifted slightly, something almost like approval flickering across her tired features. "No, they do not. Which is precisely why you have been brought here, Vorenkas. You were present for first contact. You spoke directly with Captain Cole. Your assessment of the situation carries weight that none of us sitting comfortably here in this chamber can claim." I recounted everything I had witnessed, every detail of my exchange with Ethan Cole, the calm precision of his ship's crew, the careful restraint evident in every aspect of the encounter, and the unsettling honesty of his final words to me about capabilities too dangerous to use even once, without lasting consequence. The room remained silent throughout my account, several officials exchanging worried glances as I described the deliberate, disciplined nature of everything I had observed. This matches what our own historical archivists have finally managed to piece together, Director Sorn said once I finished. "We have spent the last 3 days granting emergency clearance to researchers across every major archive in Council space, searching for any surviving record of what actually happened before the quarantine began. Most of what we found had been deliberately obscured, buried beneath layers of bureaucratic redaction that suggest the original architects of the quarantine wanted this information hidden as thoroughly as possible." "What did you find?" I asked. Director Sorn exchanged a glance with several other officials before answering, as though seeking silent permission to share what came next. Fragments only, but troubling ones. It appears that roughly 10,000 years ago, a coalition of several minor species attempted an unprovoked assault against a human settlement located near what we now call the Hollow Border. The details of why remain unclear, though some records suggest simple greed, a desire to claim resource-rich systems the humans had already settled and developed. And the humans responded, I said quietly, already understanding where this story was heading. The humans responded, Director Sorn confirmed, with a level of force that ended the conflict within a matter of days. Every ship belonging to the attacking coalition was disabled or destroyed. Every settlement involved in planning the assault experienced what the ancient records euphemistically describe as, quote, total systemic collapse, unquote. We do not know the exact number of casualties, because the records that might have contained that information were among those deliberately destroyed. What we do know is that the response was swift, overwhelming, and precise enough that human forces suffered almost no losses of their own. The room fell into uneasy silence, as everyone present absorbed the weight of that information. I thought of Cole's words again, his careful admission that some capabilities were locked away, not from lack of trust, but because using them changed something inside a person that could never fully be undone. After that conflict, Director Sorn continued, the ancient council of that era reached an agreement with human representatives. The humans would withdraw entirely from galactic affairs, remaining isolated within their own territory, and in exchange, the rest of the galaxy would leave them alone completely, never approaching, never testing, never provoking. Both sides apparently understood this arrangement as being in everyone's best interest. The humans, it seems, did not wish to be placed in a position where they might need to demonstrate that level of force again, and every other species involved understood, quite clearly, why avoiding that possibility mattered. 10,000 years is a long time to maintain an agreement built on fear nobody remembers the reason for, Counselor Aldous said grimly. It was inevitable that someone, eventually, would forget or ignore the warning. Which brings us to our current predicament, Director Sorn said, turning her attention back toward me directly. The quarantine has been broken, not through any fault of the Council, but through the reckless actions of a single greedy mining captain who paid the price for his own poor judgment, fortunately, without loss of life on either side. Captain Cole has indicated a willingness to establish some form of direct communication between our two civilizations. We need someone to lead that diplomatic effort, someone who has already demonstrated the judgment and composure necessary to navigate a situation with no precedent in recorded history. I understood immediately what she was asking, and I felt the same cold weight settle into my chest that I had experienced staring at that first activated signal from my quiet post along the border. You want me to lead the delegation? I want you to lead the delegation, Director Sorn confirmed. You have already established a rapport with Captain Cole. You understand the stakes involved better than anyone else currently available to us. And frankly, Vorenkas, I believe your instincts about this situation have proven more accurate than every panicked committee report that has crossed my desk in the last 3 days. I glanced around the room at the assembled officials, each of them watching me, with expressions ranging from cautious hope to barely concealed relief that this responsibility would fall to someone other than themselves. I thought of my sister Ilsa, of the bedtime stories I used to tell her about sleeping monsters beyond the border, and I understood now, with terrible clarity, that those stories had never been about monsters at all. They had been about a species so capable of overwhelming force that the entire galaxy had chosen fear and distance over any possibility of provoking them again. What exactly would this mission involve? I asked. You would travel to the edge of confirmed human territory, accompanied by a small diplomatic escort, to establish formal contact with whatever governing authority the humans currently maintain, Director Sorn explained. Your primary objective would be preventing any escalation on either side while we work toward a more permanent framework for renewed contact between our civilizations. Given what we now understand about human capabilities, avoiding escalation should be considered the highest priority of this entire mission. And if escalation happens anyway, I asked. If some other reckless faction decides to test the boundary the way Captain Ashworth did? Director Soren's expression darkened considerably. Then we hope, Vorenkas, that whatever restraint the humans demonstrated during this first encounter continues to hold. Because if it does not, I do not believe there exists a fleet in Council space capable of withstanding a repeat of what happened 10,000 years ago. I accepted the assignment that same day, understanding fully the weight of what I was agreeing to carry. Within 72 hours, I found myself aboard a modest diplomatic vessel called the Halcyon Path, accompanied by a small crew selected specifically for their calm temperaments and diplomatic training, traveling once again toward the boundary I had spent my entire career defending from a comfortable distance. Among my escort was a young Voth linguist named Petra Wren, whose enthusiasm for the mission stood in stark contrast to the quiet dread most of us carried. She spent much of our transit time studying every scrap of recovered data from the Halverson Star incident, cataloging speech patterns, cultural references, any detail that might help us better understand the species we were about to formally engage. "Have you noticed," she said to me during one of our final days of transit, "that every recorded statement from Captain Cole contains almost no boasting, no exaggeration, no attempt to intimidate through language alone? It is almost as though restraint has become such a fundamental part of their communication style that they have forgotten how to speak any other way. Or they never forgot how to speak differently," I said. "They simply choose not to, because they understand exactly how much weight their words already carry without embellishment." Petra considered that observation in silence for a long moment. "That is a more unsettling interpretation than my own." "Unsettling but likely more accurate," I said, staring out at the passing stars, watching the boundary line grow closer on our navigation display once again. "We are not traveling to meet a species that needs to prove its strength through words or gestures. We are traveling to meet a species that has already proven everything it needs to prove 10,000 years ago, and has spent every day since then simply choosing not to prove it again." The Halcyon Path crossed the hollow border for the second time in my career, carrying with it the fragile hope of an entire galaxy that 10,000 years of careful silence might yet be salvaged into something resembling lasting peace. I did not know, as we approached the edge of confirmed human territory, whether that hope was realistic or simply the desperate wishing of officials who understood, deep down, that the choice no longer belonged to us alone. We reached the edge of confirmed human territory 4 days later, and I will admit that nothing in my training had prepared me for what greeted us there. I had expected fortified defenses, aggressive patrol patterns, perhaps some visible demonstration of the strength that had ended a conflict in a matter of days 10,000 years ago. Instead, we found a single outpost station, modest in size, orbiting a quiet blue planet that showed no obvious signs of military presence at all. Captain Cole met us personally as our shuttle docked with the station, standing at the airlock alongside 2 other crew members who greeted us with a warmth that caught me completely off guard. Up close, Cole appeared entirely unremarkable, a man of average height with tired eyes and a weathered face that suggested years of difficult decisions rather than any obvious physical dominance. It was strange, standing before him, to reconcile his ordinary appearance with everything Director Soren's archives had revealed about what his species had once done. "Vorenkas," he said, extending a hand toward me in a gesture Petra had briefed us was a traditional human greeting. "I'm glad it's you they sent." I accepted the gesture, finding his grip firm but not aggressive, and something about the simple humanity of that small exchange eased a portion of the tension I had carried across 4 days of transit. "Captain Cole, thank you for agreeing to this meeting." "Please, call me Ethan," he said, gesturing for our small delegation to follow him deeper into the station. "I imagine formality is going to feel exhausting for both of us, if we maintain it through everything we need to discuss." The station's interior surprised me almost as much as its modest exterior had. I had expected sterile efficiency, perhaps cold and mechanical corridors reflecting a species defined entirely by disciplined restraint. Instead, I found warmth, color, small personal touches scattered throughout common areas that suggested people who lived here, who built lives and relationships and small comforts even in the isolation of deep space. Photographs lined one corridor wall, faces I did not recognize smiling alongside handwritten notes in a language Petra identified as commemorating crew members who had served aboard various vessels over the years. "You seem surprised," Ethan said, noticing my attention lingering on the photographs. "I expected something different," I admitted. "Most people do, at first," he said, a faint smile touching the corner of his mouth. "I think there's a tendency to imagine that a species capable of the things we're capable of must somehow be defined entirely by that capability. The truth is more complicated. We laugh, we argue, we miss our families when we're away too long. Being capable of terrible things doesn't erase everything else that makes a person who they are. It just means that capability sits alongside everything else, waiting, hopefully never needed." He led our delegation to a small conference room where several other human representatives waited, including a woman he introduced as Laura Bennett, a senior diplomatic officer whose calm authority reminded me somewhat of Director Sorn herself. The negotiations that followed stretched across several hours, careful and deliberate, both sides working through the delicate process of establishing terms for renewed contact between civilizations separated by 10,000 years of silence. Ethan proved patient throughout the discussions, willing to explain human customs and expectations in detail whenever Petra or I requested clarification, and willing to listen carefully whenever we explained the fears and misunderstandings that had shaped Council perception of his people over the centuries. By the end of that first day, I found myself feeling something I had not expected to feel toward a representative of the species I had spent my entire life fearing, something close to genuine respect. That evening, Ethan invited me to walk with him along one of the station's observation decks, away from the formal negotiations, away from the careful diplomatic language that had defined our interactions so far. The observation deck offered a wide view of the quiet blue planet below, its surface dotted with small lights marking scattered human settlements. "Can I ask you something personal?" I said, watching the planet turn slowly beneath us. "Of course." "Are you afraid of what happens next? Of what your own people might have to do if something goes wrong during this process of renewed contact?" Ethan was quiet for a long moment, his expression difficult to read in the dim lighting of the observation deck. "Every single day," he said finally. "I have spent my entire career hoping I would never have to fully use everything my training prepared me for. 10,000 years of isolation gave my people time to build a civilization we're genuinely proud of, a life worth protecting without needing to prove anything to anyone. I would give almost anything to keep it that way." "But you don't believe that's guaranteed?" "No," he said, and I heard genuine sadness in his voice, for the first time since our acquaintance began. "History has a way of repeating itself, when people forget the lessons that shaped it. Your council forgot why the quarantine existed. Given enough time, some faction somewhere will forget why provoking us was ever considered dangerous in the first place. I am hopeful that this renewed contact leads somewhere better than that. But hope and certainty are different things, Vorenkas, and I have learned to prepare for the difference between them." I thought about those words carefully over the following days as negotiations continued, as our two delegations worked slowly toward a framework that might allow both civilizations to coexist without repeating the mistakes that had led to 10,000 years of fearful silence. On the 5th day of our talks, however, news arrived that shattered the fragile calm we had managed to build. A message came through from Director Sorn herself, her expression tight with barely controlled alarm as it appeared on our comm display. "Vorenkas, I need you to remain calm as I explain this, and I need you to understand that the decision was not made lightly on either side." "What's happened?" I asked, my stomach already tightening with dread. "A single human vessel has been dispatched toward your home system," Director Sorn said. "Captain Cole informed me only moments ago that this was intended as a gesture of goodwill, a demonstration of trust following the progress made during your negotiations. The vessel is meant to establish a formal diplomatic presence near Thesari space, nothing more. But you understand, better than most, how this news is likely to be received by a population that has spent 10,000 years fearing exactly this kind of arrival. I felt the blood drain from my face as the implications settled over me. My homeworld, where my sister Ilsa still lived with her own children, where every citizen had grown up hearing the exact same warnings I once whispered to her as a child, was about to witness the arrival of a single human warship with absolutely no context beyond 10,000 years of unexplained dread. I found Ethan immediately, my composure fraying for the first time since our diplomatic mission had begun. Why would you send a ship there without warning, without explanation? You know exactly what kind of fear that arrival is going to trigger. Ethan's expression carried genuine regret as he listened to my concerns. The timing was meant to coincide with a formal announcement explaining the vessel's purpose, transmitted simultaneously to Thessari planetary authorities. I take full responsibility if that coordination failed on our end. That was never our intention, Vorenkas. Intention rarely matters once panic takes hold, I said, my voice tighter than I meant it to sound. My people have spent 10,000 years being taught that any human presence represents the end of everything they know. A single ship arriving without proper context is exactly the kind of situation that could trigger exactly the disaster we have been working so hard to prevent. Ethan's jaw tightened, and for the first time since I had met him, I saw something harder flicker behind his tired eyes, a glimpse of the discipline and readiness that Petra had noted in her early analysis of his communication style. Then we need to move quickly to ensure that context reaches your people before fear does something none of us can undo. I will accompany you personally to Thessari space aboard my own vessel. Perhaps my direct presence will help demonstrate that this arrival was never meant as a threat. I stared at him, uncertain whether his offer represented genuine reassurance or simply escalated the very danger we were trying to avoid. You would put yourself directly at the center of a situation that could turn hostile within moments of your arrival. I would rather stand at the center of that danger and work to prevent it, Ethan said quietly, than sit safely at a distance while a misunderstanding spirals into something neither of us can control. We departed for Thessari space within hours, Ethan's own vessel, the Farsight, traveling alongside our diplomatic ship as escort, rather than the single warship Director Sorn had originally described. I spent the entire journey consumed by anxiety, imagining every possible way this arrival could unfold, replaying Director Sorn's careful warning about capabilities too dangerous to provoke even once. When we finally emerged into Thessari space, the scene that greeted us confirmed every fear I had carried across that anxious transit. Planetary defense forces had already scrambled in response to the initial human vessel's arrival, dozens of ships forming a defensive perimeter around my homeworld, weapons hot, communication channels flooded with panicked reports and conflicting orders. Somewhere below, on the surface of the world where I had grown up hearing bedtime stories about sleeping monsters, an entire population had descended into exactly the kind of terror those stories had always promised would come. And drifting quietly at the center of that chaos, unmoving, its weapons systems deliberately powered down despite the dozens of hostile vessels surrounding it, sat a single human warship, patient and calm, waiting to see whether 10,000 years of careful restraint would be enough to survive its first true test. I ordered our diplomatic ship to broadcast on every available frequency the moment we arrived, desperate to reach planetary command, before panic turned into something irreversible. My voice shook as I identified myself, explaining as quickly as I could that the human vessel's presence was intended as a diplomatic gesture, that Captain Ethan Cole himself had traveled here specifically to prevent exactly the kind of misunderstanding now unfolding around us. Voren Kas, this is Fleet Commander Talis Oren of Thessari Home Defense, a tense voice responded almost immediately. We have a foreign warship sitting motionless in our home system with no prior warning and no acceptable explanation. Our orders are to hold position and demand immediate withdrawal. I need you to understand that patience among my command staff is running extremely thin. Commander, please listen to me carefully, I said. That vessel's weapons are deliberately powered down. Its captain is aboard my own escort ship right now, willing to speak directly with your government, to explain everything. Attacking that ship would be the single worst decision our people could possibly make right now. That decision is not mine alone to make, Commander Oren said, and I could hear the strain in his voice, the weight of an entire population's fear pressing down on him through every channel flooding his command deck. Civilian panic is spreading faster than any official explanation can travel. I have received 3 separate reports of unauthorized weapons fire from private militia vessels who launched without proper clearance the moment that human ship appeared on our sensors. My blood ran cold at those words. Unauthorized fire against the human vessel? Confirmed, Commander Oren said grimly. 2 shots, neither one causing apparent damage according to our sensors, but the intent was unmistakable. I turned immediately toward Ethan, who had been listening to the entire exchange in tense silence beside me. His expression had shifted into something I had not seen from him before, a stillness that felt entirely different from his usual calm composure, more controlled, more deliberate, as though every muscle in his body had settled into readiness without any corresponding change in his outward demeanor. "Ethan," I said quietly, "please tell me your ship did not respond to that fire." "My ship did not respond," he confirmed, and I felt a wave of relief pass through me, quickly followed by renewed dread as he continued speaking. "But I need you to understand something important, Vorenkas. My crew exercised restraint because I ordered them to, and because I still believe this situation can be resolved without further escalation. That restraint has limits, however, and those limits exist for reasons your own council archives have already confirmed to you." "I understand," I said, my voice barely steady. "Then help me reach your Commander Oren directly," Ethan said. "Every moment we spend routing this conversation through intermediaries is another moment for fear to make decisions that calm minds would never choose." I patched Ethan directly into the command channel, and I listened as he addressed Commander Oren with the same measured, careful voice he had used during our very first conversation across the boundary line, days that now felt like an entire lifetime ago. "Commander Oren, this is Captain Ethan Cole of the Farsight. I understand the fear my ship's arrival has caused, and I take full responsibility for the coordination failure that allowed this situation to unfold without proper warning to your people. My weapons remain powered down. I have no intention of causing harm to your world or your citizens. I am requesting only the opportunity to explain my presence directly to your leadership before this situation escalates any further." There was a pause, tense and uncertain, before Commander Oren finally responded. "Captain Cole, I want to believe your intentions are peaceful, but I have an entire population in a state of panic, unauthorized weapons fire already directed at your vessel, and 10,000 years of warnings telling every single person on this world that your arrival represents the end of everything we know. I cannot guarantee that every ship under my command will continue exercising the same restraint your vessel has shown." "Then let us work together to ensure that restraint holds," Ethan said. "I am willing to withdraw my ship to a greater distance immediately, if that would ease tensions while we establish proper communication with your government." For a moment, it seemed as though the crisis might resolve exactly as Ethan hoped, through careful words and mutual restraint, rather than through the disaster 10,000 years of fear had always predicted. Then, everything changed in the span of a few terrifying seconds. A cluster of unauthorized militia vessels, operating outside official command structure entirely, launched a coordinated strike against the Farsight, ignoring every order from Commander Oren's own command staff to stand down. I watched in horror through our sensor feed as weapons fire lit up the darkness around the human vessel, dozens of shots converging on a target that had done nothing but sit motionless, weapons powered down, waiting patiently for a chance at peaceful resolution. "Ethan!" I shouted, my composure completely gone. The response, when it came, unfolded with a speed and precision that left me breathless. The Farsight's shields activated in the space of a single heartbeat, absorbing the initial barrage without visible damage. Then, rather than launching any counterattack of its own, the ship simply moved, sliding through the chaotic scattering of militia vessels with a grace that defied everything I understood about how starships were supposed to maneuver, disabling engine systems and weapons arrays on each attacking vessel in turn, without a single shot fired in return. I watched, stunned, as one militia ship after another went dark, their propulsion and weapons systems rendered inert by something I could not fully identify on my sensors, drifting harmlessly now amid the chaos they had helped create. Not a single vessel was destroyed. Not a single crew member, as far as our sensors could determine, suffered any lasting harm. And yet the demonstration of capability left every observer, myself included, utterly speechless. "This is Captain Cole to all Thessari vessels." Ethan's voice came through every channel, calm and steady, despite what had just occurred. "I have disabled the ships that fired upon my vessel, without causing lasting harm to their crews. I am asking, one final time, for the opportunity to speak with your leadership peacefully. I do not wish for this encounter to become anything more than it already has." The silence that followed felt heavier than any silence I had experienced throughout this entire ordeal. Somewhere across my homeworld, an entire population had just witnessed exactly what 10,000 years of warnings had always promised, and yet the reality of it felt entirely different from anything those old stories had prepared us to understand. There had been no cruelty in what I witnessed. No excessive force, only precise, controlled restraint applied exactly as far as necessary, and not a single measure further. "Commander Oren," I said quietly into the comm, "please, for the sake of everyone on that world, stand down your remaining forces. What just happened was not an attack. It was mercy, extended further than any of us had any right to expect." There was a long pause before Commander Oren finally responded, his voice heavy with something between exhaustion and dawning understanding. "Stand down all forces. Repeat, all vessels stand down immediately. No further engagement with the human ship under any circumstances." I watched as the tension across every channel slowly began to ease, as planetary defense forces reluctantly pulled back from their aggressive formation, as the immediate danger of catastrophic escalation finally began to subside. Beside me, Ethan remained quiet for a long moment, his earlier stillness gradually softening back into the tired, weathered expression I had come to recognize during our days together. "I did not want that to happen," he said finally, his voice quiet enough that only I could hear it clearly. "Every single time I am forced to demonstrate what my ship is capable of, I feel the weight of everything that restraint was built to protect against. I do not enjoy this, Vorenkas. I never have, and I suspect no one who truly understands the cost ever could." "You showed mercy," I said. "You could have destroyed every ship that fired on you. Instead, you disabled them without harm." "Because destruction was never the goal," Ethan said. "It never is, no matter what 10,000 years of frightened stories might suggest about my people. The goal has always been ending a threat as quickly and as gently as circumstances allow. Sometimes gentleness looks like disabled engines rather than destroyed ships. I would like to believe that distinction matters, even to people who have spent their whole lives fearing us without understanding why." I looked out at the scattered, dark militia vessels drifting harmlessly in the space around us, at the tense but finally settling formation of Thessari defense forces standing down from their aggressive posture, and I understood, with a clarity that settled deep into my bones, that the galaxy had just witnessed something far more significant than a simple military demonstration. We had witnessed proof that everything the ancient records described, everything Director Sorn's archives had warned us about, remained entirely true even after 10,000 years of silence, and more importantly, we had witnessed proof that the restraint accompanying that terrible capability had survived just as intact, holding fast even under direct, unprovoked attack. The question now, as the immediate crisis finally began to fade into an uneasy calm, was whether the rest of the galaxy would learn the right lesson from what had just happened here, or whether fear and forgetfulness would eventually lead someone else, somewhere else, to test that restraint once again. The weeks that followed the incident above my homeworld reshaped the entire structure of galactic politics in ways that even Director Sorn, with all her years of experience navigating council affairs, admitted she had never anticipated. News of what happened spread quickly, and unlike the panicked speculation that had defined the earliest reports of human awakening, this time the story carried something closer to truth, verified by dozens of independent sensor logs and eyewitness accounts from Thessari defense forces who had watched the entire encounter unfold with their own instruments. The reaction across council space proved far more complicated than simple fear or simple relief. Some worlds called loudly for immediate militarization, insisting that a demonstration of such overwhelming restraint capability demanded an equally overwhelming response in preparation. Others, perhaps more thoughtfully, recognized that the encounter had ended without a single fatality despite unprovoked hostile action, and began questioning whether 10,000 years of fear had been built upon a misunderstanding that deserved careful, honest reconsideration. I was called before the full Galactic Council itself 3 weeks after the incident, standing in a chamber far grander and more intimidating than the private meeting room where Director Sorn had first briefed me on my diplomatic assignment. Representatives from dozens of member worlds filled the tiered seating around me, their expressions ranging from open hostility to cautious curiosity, all of them waiting to hear my first-hand account of everything I had witnessed. Officer Vorenkas, the presiding council speaker, began, an ancient and imposing figure named Yaren Thes, whose species I had never encountered before that day. You have been present for nearly every significant moment of contact between our civilization and the human species since the quarantine's failure. The council would value your honest assessment of what we are truly facing. I stood in silence for a moment, gathering my thoughts, aware of the weight my words would carry in shaping decisions that would affect the entire galaxy for generations to come. Honored speaker, members of the council, I believe the greatest danger we face is not the humans themselves, but our own tendency to misunderstand exactly what kind of danger they represent. Murmurs rippled through the chamber, and I continued before anyone could interrupt. For 10,000 years, we have taught our children to fear a monster we could not describe, because we ourselves had forgotten the truth behind our own quarantine. That fear, born from ignorance rather than understanding, very nearly caused a catastrophe of our own making. Unauthorized militia forces attacked a vessel that had done nothing but sit motionless, weapons powered down, waiting patiently for peaceful contact. The human response to that attack was restrained beyond anything any of us had a right to expect. Every attacking ship was disabled without loss of life. That is not the behavior of monsters, honored speaker. That is the behavior of a people who understand, far better than we currently do, the true cost of the power they hold. And if that restraint had not held? Another council member asked sharply, "What then, Officer Kaz? Are we simply meant to trust the goodwill of a species capable of ending an entire coalition's resistance within days, based on nothing more than the word of officers who spent a handful of weeks in their company?" "I am not suggesting blind trust," I said carefully. "I am suggesting that 10,000 years of fear, born from silence, has proven far more dangerous than honest, careful engagement ever could. The humans did not choose isolation because they wished to remain hidden monsters. They chose it because they understood the terrible weight of what they were capable of, and they hoped that distance would prevent them from ever needing to demonstrate it again. That hope nearly failed, because our own forgetfulness allowed a reckless individual to test a boundary none of us fully understood. If we continue forward guided only by fear, we will eventually create exactly the disaster we claim to be trying to avoid." The debate that followed my testimony stretched across several more days, contentious and difficult, as representatives from across council space wrestled with the implications of everything that had happened. Eventually, a framework began to emerge, cautious and imperfect, establishing formal channels of communication between human territory and council space, alongside strict protocols designed to prevent the kind of reckless border incursions that had triggered the original crisis. I returned to Thessari space several months later, once the immediate turmoil had settled into something resembling a fragile new normal, and I found myself once again standing on the observation deck of a diplomatic vessel alongside Ethan Cole, watching my homeworld turn slowly beneath us. "Do you think it will hold?" I asked him. "This new peace we have built?" Ethan considered the question for a long moment before answering. "I think peace built on genuine understanding tends to hold far better than peace built on fear ever could. Your council finally understands, at least in part, what my people are truly capable of, and more importantly, what we choose not to do with that capability, unless left with no other option. That understanding matters more than any treaty or protocol document could ever capture. And if someone forgets again? I asked. If another generation grows complacent, another reckless individual tests a boundary they no longer understand, then we will face that moment when it comes, Ethan said, hopefully with wiser choices than either of our civilizations made the first time this happened. I do not believe perfect peace exists anywhere in this galaxy, Vorenkas. I believe only in the ongoing effort to choose understanding over fear, restraint over aggression, and honest communication over 10,000 years of silence built upon a warning nobody fully remembered the reason for. I thought about my sister Ilsa, about the bedtime stories I had told her children just weeks earlier, stories that no longer spoke of sleeping monsters beyond an unexplained border, but instead spoke honestly of a distant, disciplined people who had chosen isolation not from shame, but from a careful, painful wisdom about the weight of their own strength. It was not a comfortable story to tell children, but it was, at last, an honest one. The old rule that had shaped an entire galaxy's fear for 10,000 years had finally been broken, not through malice or conquest, but through simple human error meeting simple human greed, and the aftermath had revealed a truth far more complicated and far more hopeful than any of the frightened warnings I had grown up believing. The humans had never been a nightmare waiting to happen. They had been a quiet, careful people holding an old and terrible strength at arm's length for 10,000 years, hoping against hope that they would never need to prove it again. As my ship carried me back toward the quiet blue world where my own family waited, I found myself thinking not of fear, but of the strange, fragile hope that understanding might succeed where ignorance had failed for so long. The silence between our civilizations had ended. What grew in its place remained uncertain, difficult, and far from perfect. But for the first time in 10,000 years, it grew from truth rather than shadows, and that, I had come to believe, was worth every difficult step it had taken to reach. Somewhere out among the stars, the far sight continued its patient watch along a border that no longer needed to be forbidden, only respected, and I understood at last that the greatest lesson of everything I had witnessed was not about the power humanity held in reserve, but about the quiet discipline required to hold such power without ever needing to use it again.